Well, I think what Australia did was completely unremarkable, which is, filed a submission in the United Nations in New York, which reflects our legal position on these views, on the legitimacy of certain territorial claims made in the South China Sea. And we were, in fact, responding to a Chinese submission there, so it would be odd if we didn't put our own legal view on the record here. There's nothing provocative about that. It's a straightforward act in international affairs that happens all the time, and I think the reaction, at least from some quarters within China, and it is the Global Times, as you said, doesn't really correspond with the reality.
There is a suggestion that there may well be some form of retaliation when it comes to our beef or our wine. Would you be expecting any extra costs placed on those?
Look, I just noticed over the weekend that our export figures to China, and particularly of iron ore, have only increased over the last 3 or 4 months. And I think that speaks to an important point, that countries trade because it's in their mutual interests to do so, not because it's a favour to anyone, not because it's an act of grace or... they do it because it's in their interest to do so, and that's really has always been the basis of our trade with China. It's mutually beneficial for them to buy things from us and us to sell things to them, and vice versa, and that underpinning has not changed. So, look, they might talk about doing this. They have for a number of months. They've taken some action in some areas, which they say is unconnected to these disputes, but I think the structural basis of our trade remains as strong as it's always been.
Should we be sending warships to the seas to kind of back up that talk with some kind of action?
Well, I think we should certainly be open to joining freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. All that would do was reflect our own legal position and that of many other countries. I don't think we need to telegraph it in advance. I don't think we need to do it with a lot of fanfare. The timing of this needs to be left to our operational commanders, and ideally we do it in the company of a number of other countries. But yes, I think we certainly should be open to doing that.
Well, Peter Jennings makes the point in the paper this morning. He says the problem is if you don't do anything other than just occasionally sailing through the area, you're really giving de facto acknowledgement of the reality of Chinese control. Do you agree with his point?
Fundamentally, yes. I mean, international law is made up of, doctrine, but also practice, state practice. And if we say that we don't accept that, submerged islets and reclaimed land can give rise to territorial waters, we say that on paper, but if we observe that in practice or contradict ourselves in practice, well, that's a problem. We need to act consistently with what we say. And I think that's why, at principle, I support freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea.
OK, just a couple of other quick issues. At the moment, Dave, is it right for Josh Frydenberg to draw on Thatcherism, as he spoke about yesterday in terms of his interview, using that as kind of inspiration? Is it right for him to do that?
I think it's right for Josh, and indeed for anyone in the government, to draw inspiration from any number of political leaders. I mean, Winston Churchill is a great model of Josh's, as he is for many people. Thatcher and Reagan, who he name-checked yesterday, I think are both, titanic figures of the late 20th century who presided over some pretty substantial economic transformations in their country. Now, I think some of the challenges that we're facing, the global economy is facing, are akin to those of the late 1970s, quite different in kind, but similar in magnitude. And of course, you're going to look back in history and see what you can learn from those examples.
Unions aren't going to like that.
No, I suspect they're not. But I mean, look, Josh hasn't said we're going to reheat the policies of Margaret Thatcher and deliver them up. He said, we're obviously going to have policies adjusted to the times and the circumstances in which we find ourselves in, and they're going to reflect, Australian values, Australian political conditions, and the Australian economy.
What's some of her policies that interest you, that might be of use to us here?
Margaret Thatcher's policies?
Yeah.
Look, I can't say I'm much of a student of them, but I think what she did do, and I don't think this is as relevant in Australia, is she dramatically reduced the number of days lost to industrial action. She improved home ownership by giving people who are renting council flats a pathway to purchase property. She deregulated the financial sector. I mean, interestingly enough, a lot of these things that Thatcher did, we did in Australia in the 1980s and 1990s as well, under governments of both political persuasions, under the Hawke-Keating governments, which was supported by the Liberals then in opposition with some of this economic reform agenda, and then with the Howard Costello government with the introduction of a broad-based consumption tax and things like that. So, Australia's been through our own journey of economic reform over the last 30 years, but as John Howard was always fond of saying, it's a never-ending journey. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint, and you always need to be looking at the next thing you need to be doing.
The Black Lives Matter protesters legally, we're not sure whether it's going to go ahead. It's before the courts at the moment, but it looks like the courts have sided with the New South Wales Police Commissioner Mick Fuller at the moment, but the protesters are vowing to go ahead anyway with it tomorrow, regardless of where it is or what format it's going to take. What's your view of that, Dave?
Well, my view is that these are unusual times, and whilst I would normally be, a strong defender of anyone's right to express their opinion and to protest, I think these are exceptional times we're living in. If the medical advice is that these sorts of mass gatherings should not be taking place, and that is the medical advice, then I don't think they should be. I mean, we can't risk having super spreader events. We've seen what's happened overseas. We've seen what's happened in Victoria. The chances of outbreaks are simply too high to risk these things at the moment. So I'd urge everyone to cool it for a while, find other ways to express their opinion. Be assured that when we're back to normal, these sorts of rights of protest again will be perfectly respected and perfectly tolerated. But except that we're living in unusual times. I mean, just the same as the people wandering around in Melbourne without masks or seeking to defy police instructions. I just think it beggars belief that they're doing those sorts of things.
Well, I mean, when you look at that video, I was going to ask you about that anyway. Do you think that they just want to go out and cause trouble? Because, some of the people in those videos are actually recording on their phones while they're walking into these places.
No, exactly. I mean, you can see they're filming this themselves. I mean, the self-righteousness of some of them is just staggering. It's like they've read an op-ed and decided they're a QC and they're going to make a name for themselves or something. I mean, it's poor police officers and employees of Bunnings. They're just trying to do their jobs, trying to protect the public, trying to remain open for business so they can continue to trade and the public can continue to buy things. And these people, want to get an Instagram moment or something. It's just, it's crazy.
Just a quick one. Potts Point, that's in the Wentworth electorate, isn't it? I'm just wondering if you'd be concerned about this outbreak potentially at this Thai Rock restaurant.
Yeah, I am concerned about this outbreak at the Thai Rock restaurant, and I'm glad you've been mentioning that anyone who's been there in that period needs to go and get tested. I think if it's on the east side of Macleay Street, it is in my electorate. If it's on the west side, it's in Tanya Plibersek's electorate. But regardless, I'm sure people in Wentworth have been there, and they need to isolate if they've been there, and they need to get themselves tested.